So in this presentation, we are going to delve a bit further into the components of waveforms and their imagery and defining features. We're going to touch on music theory and the naturally occurring rhythms that are present in the time and space that we currently live in. We're going to look at the expression of consciousness via these oscillations, and how we relate on a personal level to our thought constructs and emotions. So a lot of this subject matter is going to revolve around the spectrum of sound, light, color, and geometry, and the corresponding points and parallels within each. So these realms of fluctuation and pattern, they're very complex on a technical level, but attuning to them is more than attainable. It's instinctual. But I think this kind of information is important because the more clearly we perceive this process, the deeper our relationship to it grows, and thus we are able to derive more meaning and significance from the experiences of our being. So first I want us to look at a general outline of how vibration is sorted. And on a very basic level, we have single pure frequencies. So we're looking at a graduated system of sound, and we usually measure these frequencies in hertz. So the human hearing range is about 20 to 20,000 hertz. 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second, and 1,000 hertz is 1,000 cycles per second. So 1 hertz is a very low pitch, and 1,000 hertz is a much higher pitch. So an atom would be comparable to a frequency in that they are both fundamental constituents of the universal field and could be considered interchangeable in that sense. We could probably dissect frequencies and atoms further, but for the sake of this class, we are going to start here. We move from frequencies to tones or timbres, and these are combinations of pure frequencies. So we are adding in layers of harmonics. A timbre is the character or quality of a sound, so something that makes it distinguishable. So we're looking at traits such as brassy, warm, light, flat, clear, or heavy. We're looking at the difference between sound made by an oboe versus a flute, for instance. We then move a step up to musical intervals and chords. So these are combinations of frequencies and timbres. So here we are creating dynamics and relationships, states of consciousness, if you will. We then progress into music. So we're looking at combined pure frequencies and timbres that change over time. We're adding in rhythm and flow. And we're additionally bringing noise into the picture. So noise could actually be placed within any of these categories because it is so diverse in form, but it has a tendency to be more sporadic in fabrication. So noise is a grouping of sounds, and they are usually organically produced. While they generally hold less precision, many noises can still be very relaxing and favorable for our mind-body-spirit complex. So white versus pink noise. White noise contains all of the wavelengths of the visible spectrum at equal intensity. And with pink noise, the intensity of the noise decreases as frequency increases. So this evens out the sound a bit, but both cover all of the frequencies that the human ear can hear. And lastly, we are looking at energy as a whole. We are adding intention. So the quality of consciousness is going to drastically affect the energy that is relayed through the music. The quality is always affecting the energy of the waveform that it rides on. So the intention and information within each thought carries specific harmonic coding that affects others and it affects the individual. So the tone or vibratory complex of thoughts is also affected by the quality of words that pass through the mind. So when we analyze and break down these signals, we realize that frequency is only a carrier wave and intention is embedded into the various phases and envelopes of its form. So just to give a brief rundown on the layout of the body, there are 70 trillion cells that reside in the body, 210 types of cells, 250,000 reactions per second. The heart beats over 100,000 times per day. The lungs take in oxygen about 23,000 times per day. 500 billion new cells are produced per day, 100 billion new neurons produced per day. We have an array of systems that act in an interdependent manner. And I think it's safe to say that we are still not aware of the entirety of what is managed by each portion of the body and the depth of functionality. So the systems of the body include the respiratory, digestive, cardiovascular, urinary renal, endocrine, nervous, skeletal, integumentary, exocrine, lymph, and reproductive systems. So we are living symphonies. We pump, echo, and reverberate. All of these operating components create a musical of sorts, and this requires harmonious interaction in order for there to be optimal states of health. So I like this quote. It says that each celestial body, in fact, each and every atom, produces a particular sound on account of its movement, its rhythm, or vibration. All of these sounds and vibrations form a universal harmony in which each element, while having its own function and character, contributes to the whole. So, sound can be used in a multitude of ways to help find balance within the tiers of our form. So, on a physical level, we can work with healing in regards to pain, illness, and disease or disorders. Music and vibration can be nutrients. So, the idea is to find what is nourishing to our energetic bodies and field, and thus beneficial to our physical form. We can manipulate it to best sync with our moods or relieve tension, for example. And we can either feed our complex with similar or harmonic waveforms, or we can balance our complex through opposition. So, for instance, if one has excess yin or passive energy, they may need to be fed yang or more activated energy. So there are ways of working with properties of sound to achieve a desired effect. We can also work with mental and emotional faculties in promoting stress relief. So sound can be very transformative and progressive, and it can be a helpful means of processing for a person. So it can assist in releasing suppressed emotions and unhealthy beliefs that hold us back. We can also use it for brain entrainment purposes, so aiding in inducing particular states of mind. For example, you can work with sleep deprivation, hyperattention, presence of mind, creativity enhancement, receptivity or concentration, etc. We can additionally use it to spiritually advance ourselves. So, in resonating higher values, such as gratitude, compassion, love, joy, integrity, etc. And also in resonating deeper connections to spirit. So we're looking towards an integrated presence coupled with clarity or peace or relaxation. So there are obviously a lot of opinions about health and ways of handling a disruption of health. And there are many schools of thought and many branches that extend around these three health models. But here's the gist of it. The allopathic model is our traditional medical model, the warfare model. The strategy is to seek and destroy. So it finds what is wrong and rids the body of such, or it numbs one's sensation to physical distress, and this is usually done through drugs or pharmaceuticals. But basically, you are only quieting the body's attempt to communicate with you. With energy work, we can break up stuck energy and blockages, but energy can be moved around and influenced all day. But if the individual receiving work is not active in shifting habits or psychological patterns, then the energy will eventually pull back to those resonations. So the problem we run into here is that it is not beneficial to merely take away someone's issue. I think the disruptive charges are more readily cleared in one's complex when that removal is combined with will and awareness. So sometimes it is helpful to break up stuck energy and work with regaining natural flow within one's field, because that stabilization effect can help the individual think more clearly and center themselves. So there is a balancing act there. It's important to be intuitive about what an individual needs, but I feel the main idea should be to ultimately develop new perspective when working through a psychological distress. Through vibration, we can also explode cells. So this involves finding the resonant frequency of a cell and maxing its volume without affecting surrounding cells. So this concept is comparable to when a singer breaks a wine glass with the voice. So he or she matches the frequency of the glass and induces resonant vibration. And increasing that frequency and volume will make the vibrations more violent, and eventually the glass shatters. So in order to explode a cell, one has to know the resonant frequency, and this may differ within each individual. But when you are dealing with a more complex organ or tissue, it will be comprised of many frequencies. Therefore, it would be a lot harder to find those specific combinations. And of course, not really beneficial to rid the body of such important tissues unless it is absolutely necessary, because the body has its own natural processes to progress through, and it has every ability to restore itself. However, researchers are developing ways of finding specific resonant tones and combinations of tones on cellular levels. So it is hypothesized that there is a proportional vibratory mapping of sorts amongst people, and this depends on the size and density of the physical body. So kidney stones, for example, can be an extremely painful experience, and it probably wouldn't impose too harshly on the body's organic modes of processing to break those forms of matter up through vibration. There are many ways of easing symptoms and accelerating the healing process, and this I do not find to be as intrusive. It is a guiding force. So the subconscious mind can still be influenced without addressing issues so point blank or directly. But again, I do think will is key, because the body will maintain whatever needs to be maintained. An outsider cannot easily force any occurrence. So with this model, the underlying problem is yet to be resolved, it's rather incongruent with natural body processes. There's a creating of karma. So I say this loosely to mean one would be messing with another's necessary cycle within their journey. So you are allowing mentalities to continue without resolution, which could act as more of a setback in the long run. I like the quote that says, "Karma is inertia until it meets forgiveness." And this includes grace and compassion extended towards yourself and others. I think often with clear perspective comes forgiveness. But I want to note that most energetic work is synchronous with one's form, as long as one's conscious intention is constructive to the well-being of the individual. It is difficult to be disruptive. So either way, you can't do much harm unless you have an intention of doing so. Of course, we don't want to take away an individual's opportunity to learn a lesson, so it's critical that you are working with the psyche as you release those distortions of self. So with the transformation models, essentially we are looking to focus awareness and purposefully create new neurological codes. So we focus on what is wrong and then use sound and vibration to transform the offending cells or incoherent vibrations into more fluent pulsations. So as we talk about this, I hope you make the connection that because our thoughts and emotions are also vibration, the same process is applied when working towards consistent change. So for example, redefining beliefs so that they are more in line with truth. We also have the ISO principle, which involves matching the vibration of the issue and then altering it so that it is a more harmonious vibration. So we can also find the resonant frequency of a healthy cell and play that frequency back to the unhealthy cell in order to pull it back into a coherent form. So Nutri-Energetics falls under this category. It's a program that starts with a body field assessment, and this involves resting your hand on a palm-sized scanner device for a few seconds. So the NES is in effect probing the biofield and monitoring the quality of its responses at a quantum level, and then it prioritizes those results. So there are 145 biofield parameters that are being worked with in this particular program. They identify reduced energy levels and disturbed information pathways. So they have these unique liquid preparations that one takes as drops in water, and they're called infoceuticals. So each is specifically formulated and encoded with information that correlates to specific aspects of the biofield. So lastly, we are looking at the resonant health model. And with this model, we are resounding what is already right in a person. So when I say right, I am meaning healthy, so strong or lively. I don't like using the terms right or wrong necessarily because everything is essentially relative. But with this idea, we are focusing on bringing about those higher emotions or virtues. So, for example, gratitude, compassion, love, joy, patience, kindness, humility, etc. We can enhance the soul or signature song. So the soul song reveals itself as one resides in a fuller and more comfortable presence with themselves. So feeding and nourishing yourself with those things that are congruent to your specific current accumulation of self. So this comes with self-awareness and knowing what best suits you and what harmonizes with your being. This could be an activity or stimulus or meditative draw. We can also fuel our connection to spirit. So this would include sacred practices that encourage connection to the Creator or that universal oneness, which can ultimately bring us to new understandings of experience and peace of mind. We can draw attention towards healthy systems in the body and also boost the body's support system or overall well-being. So with vibration, we can find the frequency of a healthy cell and play a sound that matches or harmonizes with that cell and then feeds energy into it. So it's similar to massaging its form. It loosens and allows for better flow. So as I mentioned earlier, we can feed vibratory nutrients to an unhealthy cell and attempt to pull it back to a more normalized state. Or with this model, we can solely feed healthy cells and concentrate on current spaces of vitality. So the idea being that a strengthening of what is already strong will allow for what is incoherent to fall away because it will not be able to reside in the same space. So we can also put intention towards a positive outcome that allows those waveforms to be transmitted via the quantum field. So, for example, utilizing prayer. Now, could we scientifically find frequencies and try to match them with portions of an individual's form? Yes, possibly with some very advanced mathematics and instrumentation, but this is not required. We can intuitively create these wavelengths simply with a centered and fixated frame of mind. So I want to talk for a moment on spiritual advancement in relation to vibration. In pursuing higher states of consciousness, we are not necessarily going higher, but rather becoming more consistent. So this occurs with clarity, with focus, with presence. Now the spectrum of sound vibration does have correlating low and high tones. So the less evolved, more physically minded layers are going to resonate in more low-pitched ranges. And as the tiers grow in conscious state, so the pitches also reach those higher ranges. So a higher vibration is simply a more consistent vibration, one with fewer distortions and distractions. And the adverse emotions are going to register as an irritating and a skew sound. So for example, fear, anxiety, anger, those waveforms are going to randomly jump around from one frequency to another. So there is often a confused or blurry trait associated with these embodiments. Affirming emotions and virtues, on the other hand, will register as a smooth and steady sound. So those emotions that we mentioned earlier are more stable, more inviting. We're also looking at vowel sounds versus consonants. So what is included will depend on the mood or state desired. Consonants are a bit more masculine in their energy, more percussive. They can be used for possible entrainment purposes. Vowels tend to be more feminine, more soothing, a bit more restorative. And certainly one can merge types of sound and shape the way that they are grouped and produced. So that sound as it unfolds can be influenced in many ways by the cavity formation of the mouth and how one puts emphasis on parts of the throat. Purity is especially significant too. The purity of a tone correlates to a certain purity of being. So as we go higher in frequency, the cleanliness of the sound becomes more obvious. So keep in mind within that purity there can lie many layers still. In other words, pure here doesn't just have to be an isolated tone. We're looking more at authenticity. So there are many universal natural rhythms as well as important frequencies specific to Earth. So the Schumann resonance is 7.83 hertz. It resides in the ionosphere, which extends from about 50 to 600 miles above the Earth's surface. So it's ionized by solar radiation and holds much of the atmospheric electricity. So it's kind of like a waveguide or resonant cavity. It stores and confines a portion of the electromagnetic field. It is also triggered by lightning. So Schumann resonance excitations have been linked to transient luminous events. So electrical breakdown phenomena of sorts that occur well above the altitudes of normal lightning and storm clouds. So our forms rely on this frequency emission because of its constant presence. We are nourished by this connecting force, and astronauts actually become rather weak and ill when outside of their natural zone. So there's now a vibrational device attached to most spaceships that projects the Schumann resonance. Fluctuations in this frequency can dramatically affect our moods and energy levels as well. There's also evidence that these fluctuations correspond with, for instance, international conflicts and wars. So situations of this nature generate heat. So we're talking about when there's an activation of some kind, which could include political, economical, social, technological, or cultural kinds of activation too. Imagine what kind of atmospheric effect takes place when all of these aspects are firing at once. There are other dominant resonances that occur in the ionosphere at about 6.4 hertz intervals, but the 7.83 frequency is the most prevalent. We also have the Ohm frequency, which is 136 hertz, and this is based on the rotation of the Earth around the Sun. So Ohm itself is a Sanskrit symbol. It's a letter found in old Vedic hymns, but it's often used as a mantra. So it's typically at the beginning and end of Hindu or Buddhist prayers or texts. Ohm is also used historically to describe universal energy. So the word of God, the sound of the void kind of context. But the Ohm frequency is a scientific calculation related to the Earth and Sun dynamic specifically. Although chanting is performed with both of these principles in mind, and it does promote a unifying effect. So I wouldn't doubt it if octavizing 136 hertz led to those higher prominent cosmic frequencies. 194 hertz is also a significant frequency. It's based on the spinning of the Earth. So the first number, the Ohm frequency, is based on Earth's yearly cycle, and the second number is based on Earth's daily rotation cycle. We also have the solfeggio frequencies. So this is an ancient 6-tone scale used in sacred music and Gregorian chants. So they are said to hold spiritual harmonic resonance while also holding mathematical resonance. So all of the solfeggio frequencies can be reduced to a 3, 6, or 9 numerically. These frequencies tend to be affiliated with spiritual tiers of being, so similar to the chakra system. They follow the original ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la train. Some use a scale of 9 instead of 6, and it's difficult to assign a frequency to such a broad concept. but I do use the solfeggio frequencies at times depending on what is being called for in a session. So the Fibonacci spiral and the golden ratio are essentially one and the same. When we take any two successive Fibonacci numbers, their ratio is very close to the golden ratio. So the Fibonacci spirals are represented in nature because physical reality is structures and sequences that model quantum patterns. So every number is a combination of the two previous numbers. So theoretically, the digits go on and on into infinity. The golden ratio is A plus B divided by A, which also equals A divided by B. And the result is phi. So phi is usually rounded off to 1.618. And this number has been discovered and rediscovered many times, which is why it has so many names, including golden section, golden mean, golden number, divine proportion, etc. So historically, the number can be seen in the architecture of many natural designs. So for example, flowers, plants, galaxies, seeds, shells, hurricanes, DNA, creatures, music, etc. And with the Vitruvian Man, we're not necessarily talking about a rhythm, but he was a prominent figure for representing the proportional relationship of all parts of the body, which further reflects universal design. So it's a mathematical diagram. The image pictures the symmetry of the body and center points of gravity. So Da Vinci believed the anatomy of the human body to be an analogy for the workings of the universe. So there are several different tuning systems. Scales have changed over time, but a tuning system is just a system of pitches. So in the case of Pythagorean and just intonation, the series has a more varied flow. So it's similar to the mapping of the natural harmonics already found throughout nature. It's a more organic way of tuning and supposedly much more pleasing to the ear. With these tuning systems, a fundamental tone is chosen, and then all of its harmonics are transposed within one octave. So, an electronic tone generator that is 100% consistent can actually be detrimental to the body's systems in some instances, because little in nature occurs in those perfect mathematical patterns. It breathes. So, with equal temper tuning, it is a relatively fixed scale. You can see that each note is exactly the same distance away from the previous note all the way up the scale. There's a constant frequency multiple. So most Western and classical music is created using equal temper tuning. But many agree that it puts off a bit of a boxed in thinking or suppressed vibe. With the harmonic series, this is a sequence of frequencies in which each frequency is an integer multiple of the fundamental tone. So it follows the same form as the tuning systems we just described. So the 1 times, 2 times, 3 times pattern. It is in line with various universal orderings. So it is found in the distance between planets, the weight of the vertebrae, the electron shells in an atom, the auric bodies, the chakra system. But it's probably most similar to Pythagorean and just intonation because of the give and take found in the numbers. And the concert pitch of A while back, it was changed from 440 hertz to 432 or 444 hertz because it aligns better physically, emotionally, and spiritually. 432 hertz is softer and brighter. It's often referred to as the love frequency. So I think over time people may have given it more power collectively by putting that attribute on that tone, similar to the solfeggio frequencies. But nevertheless, it seems to hold significance for many, and it does stick out for a reason. So here's a visual for you for each of the scales. The first line is equal temper tuning, the second line is Pythagorean, and the third line is just intonation. So when we look at the formation of sound, we're looking at complete versus incomplete waveforms. So not just incomplete, but something that is regularly non-uniform. So coherency versus incoherency, smooth versus jagged, consistent versus erratic or unsteady. Incongruent waveforms will often be characterized by detuned or noisy currents, rough flow, no flow, loss of connection, or a sharp or blurred appearance. So the quality of health in any living system is going to be directly related to the quality of flow in the system. So the quality of a person's consciousness will drastically affect the energy of the waveform it's riding on. And when in a state of coherence, the heart puts out harmonics that are in golden mean ratios. So a coherent electrocardiogram signal correlates with a slowed growth of cultured cancer cells and a faster growth rate of healthy cells. So that's really critical. Also, tumors grow faster in laboratory animals who have been put in a situation where they have a sense of helplessness. So not only are there certain psychological correlations that process on a physical level, but our continued state of mind can either assist in alleviating an issue or encourage its development. So there was a study in which researchers had people walk into a space of trees with loving intention, and then had those same people approach the trees with ill intent or a motive of destruction, and the waveforms produced by the trees ended up varying greatly. They showed that reciprocated emotion one way or the other. So one reaction based on fondness, they were clear and fluent forms, and the other being fear. So it was more disorderly, more of a panicky or distressed response. So while there may be no negative emotions per se, there are those that can be detrimental to the body. So there are those influences that support health and well-being and those that do not. So some examples of damaging emotion would be superior or inferior realms of thinking, confusion, distraction, or uncertainty. And resistance to these emotions is what often leads to blockages. So when there is resistance, the emotion never has the chance to complete or release. The key to emotional competence is to not stay too long. We can either be the emotion or we can be present alongside the emotion. So the goal is to be present with the emotion so long as you need to be, but to not become attached to a feeling. A subjective feeling harbored in the body for a prolonged period of time tends to reveal itself in illness. mental and physical. So, unfortunately, many people are exposed to repeated trauma, and often at a young age, in that more vulnerable stage. So it's not uncommon for people to develop chronic issues because of this, regardless of one's age. We're not always taught to alter perspective and allow ourselves and others those spaces of compassion and forgiveness. But indeed, I think this is essential for growth. Your system is very resilient. So if you feel angry or upset or stressed, acknowledge why that is occurring and attempt to bring forth that centered rationale, which may take time. We filter our experiences through the ego, which will be inclined towards personal attitudes. So it's conducive to our being for us to reevaluate angles and understand the full context of a situation. So this is by no means a complete list, but it is one way of categorizing emotion. I'll let you pause and scan through these if you'd like. Superior realms of thinking are going to be more dominant in nature, and the inferior realms more recessive. So it's helpful to decide which thoughts you want to own, what you want to keep versus what you want to discard. Your mind will run daily marathons. So when you inevitably drop into an inferior or superior thought form, refocus and affirm what rings true to your core. It's favorable for us to identify those destructive thought patterns or ego fears from the healthy patterns of spiritual love, truth, and power in order to make informed choices about our lives and have personal discernment. So, people are often externally affected by others who are habitually entrained into those harmful mental states. And of course, they have usually undergone some kind of trauma or pain. So there is a soul fragmentation or spiritual disconnect occurring. But it's up to us to separate ourselves out from that, but also recognize that we have all at one time treated others in these manners as well. So it's something to be mindful of. So the following is a list of techniques for dealing with emotion using the voice. So we can make the sound of the emotion with the intention of releasing it. We can make the sound of the emotion and transform it into a harmonious sound. We can make the sound of the remedy for the stuck emotion. We can tone in resonance with the particular part of the body that is holding the emotion. We can resonate our home or soul song. Or we can harmonize those higher emotions and resonate consistent, coherent frequencies. So this list could go on. When you confront an emotional charge of some kind, vocal expressions can be an interesting way of dealing with it. They can be very powerful. And I think sometimes people may feel improper when expressing themselves in such a way. It can come across as maybe childlike or even animalistic. But I think it is effective. And the faster we push something out of our system, the quicker we move through it psychologically, which will affect our root of healing. It seems to be the consensus that a substantial amount of adverse physical symptoms end up being related to emotive disturbances or degrading or unsound thought constructs or beliefs. So these are usually ideas or notions that you repeatedly encounter. But we work through these distortions from many angles. Sound is just one of them. We have an array of stimuli and avenues of sensory perception at our fingertips. Music falls under the umbrella of vibration. Light and color can be used in therapeutic manners as well, though. So just about anything that exists in your reality can be utilized in some form or fashion to assist you as you seek to become a more refined you. So be intuitive with your choices. So the following are very general approaches to dealing with various states of mind, and I represented them with characterized lines. So I'm going to call them interactive progressions. When working towards a state of balance, we can meet someone at the level that they are at, bring them down into lower, more reflective spaces, and then back up for functionality. When we're working with activation, we can bring a person into more enlivened and energized space. When we're attempting to relax, we can of course bring that person down to a place of deep peace and presence. When we're dealing with obstacles, we can pursue resolution and the release of an experience. When someone is seeking stability, we're going to follow more of a steady forward motion. So all of these things are something for a therapist to consider as he or she decides on what the flow of a session is going to be. But it can also be used as you come in contact with other living beings. So it becomes valuable for us to be aware of where another being currently resides and what it is that they need, what will serve their highest good. So a therapist could create an atmosphere suited to the client and move them through an appropriate course in the session. And this could be done by using sound in a specific way, or by implementing other persuasive factors. But you can also be that complementary force as you navigate your reality and encounter others. And we can assess other people's current manner of being, so their disposition, energy level, mood, or state of mind, and we can assist them in adjusting to healthier space if that is what is necessary. And within every interaction, the flow may be much more dynamic than these examples. In fact, it probably will be. But the idea is that you remain focused and open to what it is that you can bring to the table. So if a therapist has the intention of helping someone soften and unwind, he or she may choose bassier notes or deep colors or delta binaural beats or earthy oils or stones as part of the session. And in the same way, if you wanted to help calm another being in your everyday life, you may modify your tone and manner of speaking to be more gentle and slow. You may suggest conversing in a warm setting while drinking chamomile tea. But constructive reciprocation and composure of mind are what's key here. With environmental dissonance, we're looking at toxins that are disrupting the vibratory layout of the natural flow of planetary energetic systems. So we are constantly ingesting overly processed foods. There are chemicals and plastics in water and impurities in the air that we breathe, etc. And all of these things are going to affect our fields and thus our well-being. So certainly other people's energy can also be disconcerting or agitating, and can create dissonance in the body. Even disruptive noises, so city noises or machinery and such, those can be rather off-putting as far as the noise itself goes. But both the earth and the body have a feedback system that naturally heals itself, so it pulls back towards a balance. The earth is very resilient, but this only goes so far. We're still responsible for the impact that we have on the environment, and we need to be highly mindful of the future implications of our carelessness, because the earth will respond and rediscover her balance, whether we are on board or not. So the clock is ticking. We're also dealing very regularly with artificial electromagnetism. So artificial electromagnetic fields are thousands of jumbled frequencies that fill the air. So with this, we're talking about electricity and household appliances and systems, dimmers, lighting, Wi-Fi, computers, power lines. We're also looking at radars and transmitters, so cell phones and radios, and even medical imaging deals with radiation. So extended exposure to these high-intensity, artificially generated electromagnetic fields has been associated with increased incidence of disease and mental illness. Artificial EMFs are 100 to 200 times greater than what existed just 2 generations ago, and they can harden cell membranes and alter DNA and adversely impact hormone and neurological processes, which of course can lead to a barrage of serious health complications. So we're really talking about a decline in overall functioning here. And that's not to mention the added effects of geoengineering, but that is another rabbit hole of sorts. And even though living beings are highly adaptable and can become accustomed to these changes, I think the more intensely and quickly we are subjected to them, the more detrimental they will be to our form. Most of these artificial EMFs are low-level radiation. However, we're surrounded by many of these technologies in greater numbers throughout the day and repeatedly over the course of time, and this causes long-term effects on state of mind and physical functioning. So even using something as simple as a power conditioner to help smooth out the erratic frequencies being emitted is helpful. There are many steps that we can take to reduce the negative effects of this. So harmonics are a conglomeration of tones within a root or fundamental note. So, for example, flutes have a more clean, refined sound, therefore the harmonics will be less pronounced. And a trumpet will have a richer, fuller sound with more apparent harmonic interplays. So the more distortion that is added, the more saturated the tone becomes, and the more harmonics that are produced. So we can work with these characteristics of sound to bring about certain effects. We can look at odd versus even harmonics. So with the odd harmonics, these tend to be a bit more rough in sound. They are more activating. And the harmonics are in odd frequency multiples of the fundamental tone. And with the even harmonics, these are more pleasing to the ear. They're more calming, more melodious, and they are obviously even frequency multiples of the fundamental tone. We can also look at number of harmonics, the volume of those harmonics, or the phase or timing of the harmonics. So phase is affected by how the sound moves past a fixed location and how it is hence expressed. So waveforms could move in unison or they could be out of sync. But each of these traits contribute to the overall structure of sound. So there are many components of sound that can be manipulated to create a certain atmosphere, and this is dependent on the individual and his or her intention or desired state of mind. We can look at pure versus rich sound and their overtones, consonants versus vowels, high versus low tones, long versus short, so staccato versus sustained. We can look at half tones, which are our flat and sharp notes. We can look at rhythm and vibrato or tremolo. So vibrato is a modulation effect that varies pitch, and tremolo is a modulation effect that varies amplitude or volume. And this creates a sense of rhythm and movement. We can tone or hum. We can use songs or chanting or mantras or instruments such as crystal bowls, Tibetan bowls, tingshas, chimes, tuning forks, didgeridoos, gongs, shakers, rattles, drums, etc. And these instruments are common in healing practices, but obviously there are numberless ways of generating sound. Additionally, we have synthesized sounds, tone generators, human sounds, animal sounds, nature, and weather. Fun fact, studies have shown that bird sounds actually activate the metabolism in plants. So there is a doubling or even tripling of crop growth and a greater volume of vitamins and minerals stored. So all that vibrates will produce sound, but we have a rather limited range of hearing as a human being and can't always pick up on the signals in an auditory manner. So with things such as food, water, light, color, thoughts, or emotion, but we can convey the essence of those subtle vibrations through the sound that we are able to perceive. So there's no blunt protocol on inducing a particular state of mind. People will respond to various factors differently, so they will be rather biased in the way that they react to certain types of music or vibration. But like I've said many times, intention is one of the more important aspects, if not the most important. It can ride on any waveform, but naturally there are those that will be more fitting. So these are solid guidelines when creating a setting or working with someone's form. The choices in sound could depend on if the individual's field is predominantly yin or yang energy. Do they need a counterforce, or do they need to be met where they're at and transformed out of that mode? But these sound traits are divided into two categories, one of general calming characteristics and one of general activating characteristics. So I'll let you pause and look this over because we've already covered most of what is contained in these lists. So cymatics is the study of wave phenomena and vibration. It's a visual display of sound. Researchers will put sand, dust, or liquid on a metal plate connected to an oscillator, which can produce a broad spectrum of frequencies. And the substances are then organized into different structures, characterized by geometric shapes and patterns. So with purity comes definition of shape. The intricacy of these mandala-like patterns becomes more complex with the higher frequencies. which is interesting because higher tones represent more evolved layers of the quantum field. Resonances are also much higher in pitch inside the body because the sound is traveling 4 times as fast through the water molecules as opposed to air. So the body is comprised of mostly water, about 70%, and thus is especially receptive to sound. But I suggest you YouTube cymatics. There are some cool videos on there that can give you a clearer example of what I'm talking about. I also like the quote that says, subatomic neutrons, protons, and quarks. Quarks are just a group of subatomic particles, are like musical notes on strands similar to tiny little rubber bands or little violin strings. When the rubber band is twanged, each of the subatomic particles changes from one frequency to another, electron to neutrino. When the rubber band is twanged enough times, it can change into all of the subatomic particles you see in the world. Physics is the law of harmony among the notes of these vibrating strings. Chemistry is the melody that you can play on these strings. The universe is thus a symphony of strings, and the mind of God is cosmic music resonating through dimensional hyperspace. So there are many ways of using the voice for internal work. We can examine something as simple as the key of the voice. So every song is in a particular key. Every song has a home note. And individuals, too, tend to speak in a specific key. So we have those gravitational manners of speaking. And I've heard that the easiest vocal emission that one can make is one of the most effective grounding tones. So this would appear as an exhale coupled with a hum of sorts. And there's potential difference for this note in every person. There's something very magical about reverberating sound through the body using one's own voice. And it's important to look at the resonation of our thoughts and words and emotions, because not only can the vocal range and physical tone of the expression be indicative of characteristics of a person, but the layers of energetic context that emit with the verbal sounds really allow for deeper understanding and fuller perception. So some people are more musical in their relay of self. They are more dynamic. But silence can also speak volumes. But remember that silence does not necessarily reduce what is being communicated. There are significant levels of exchange that occur between living beings subliminally. So we can look at these words, thoughts, and emotions and how they resonate into our reality and in the body. And even when not externally expressed, they hold space and ring out in our systems, which also affects our environment and the people with whom we come in contact with. And if we're talking larger scale, it's affecting the collective consciousness too. There is a doctor named Alfred Tomatis who works with voice analysis and identifies missing frequencies in the body's systems. So there's a regeneration that occurs through toning or listening to a note. So we're looking at the idea that all occurrences within one's form are supported by a frequency landscape, if you will, of physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual qualities. So your voice reflects that frequency landscape. There is software available that analyzes the voice to see what notes are missing or what notes hit too often, and it plays back the appropriate frequencies. There's another software that I use sometimes called the Portical program, and the aspiration mode starts at 0 and builds up those harmonics in need of support, whereas the intention mode starts with all of the harmonics present and over time drops off those not in need of support. So it collects information via a person speaking, singing, whispering, or humming, etc. And this further impacts the auditory feedback loop. So you are listening to your own voice on a modulated machine, which helps you integrate patterns and rhythms within your own voice. And Tomatis's work can also be utilized to assist in balance and coordination. So the vestibule is a part of the inner ear that informs the brain of body movement. So different frequencies are said to activate different types of motor skills. Jeffrey Thompson is another therapist whose work revolves around behavioral psychoacoustics and clinical neuroacoustic therapies. He incorporates necessary frequencies into musical soundtracks in order to make spinal and cranial adjustments, stimulate and normalize organ function, entrain brain waves, balance meridians, etc. So he uses frequencies to trigger health benefits, essentially. If missing frequencies are presented to the ear, there is generally an instantaneous and unconscious restoration of frequencies in the voice. And if there is sufficient auditory stimulation, there will be a lasting improvement in the ability to listen and reproduce these sounds. So this can branch into some pretty abstract ideas. The dynamics and interactions that we participate in can really be helpful in personal renewal and the inciting of inspiration. So we can look at all frequencies as being nutrients. We already covered voice analysis and those harmonics that are lacking from the voice. There are also audiograms, which are hearing tests, and they assess what cannot be heard. So the idea being that where there is a disturbance in the input and output of sound, there are corresponding disturbances that are reflected in the body and mind as well. So it's important to recall that we are holograms, and that means that all pieces of the whole mirror the whole. So there are small unique arrangements in our form that depict these various aspects of our condition. Reflexology, for example, is a common modality. This is a body map on the layout of the foot or hand. Iridology is another. This is a body map of the eye. There are body maps of the tongue and ear as well. And I am certain that there are similar findings within other regions of the body, but those that I just listed are the ones that I'm most familiar with. We can also look at movement and evaluate restrictions. So there are inferences about health and wellness that can be made based on all of those readings. The cochlea is a part of the inner ear that contains about 16,000 hair cells dedicated to a narrow frequency range. So they translate the fluid vibration of sound. It's almost one frequency per hair, but not quite. So remember that we hear from about 20 to 20,000 hertz. If hearing loss does occur, there is a protein that is said to support the regrowth of these sensory cells, but I believe this is still undergoing further study. Fun fact though, endocrine glands are constructed similarly to the ear and are not surprisingly especially receptive to sound. But when certain muscles, like the stapedius muscle, in the ear don't move freely like they are supposed to, it can cause issues similar to missing nutrients because sound is not properly processed and it may be distorted. Also, if one ear is deficient in hearing overall or within specific frequency ranges, imbalances may occur in the body's system. For instance, if a person was left ear dominant, that may lead to stronger emotional reactions because the right brain would be fed substantially more sound. So, ecosystems tend to house species that produce sounds that cover the frequency spectrum. So, this usually includes insects, bugs, small creatures, amphibians, mammals, etc. Some will have very low vocal emissions, some high, but each species is likely to cover a different portion of the spectrum. Every ecosystem is unique because of all of the animals that carry distinguishing vocal features. Being present in nature is very nourishing for many reasons, but of course I think we all know that. It's interesting because sound nutrients actually come from the mother's voice through bone conduction as it is transmitted down the mother's spine towards the fetus. So anything that inhibits natural flow of sound nutrients while in utero can dramatically affect the physical and emotional growth of the fetus. I would say also that this includes the mood and state of the mother while carrying, and those vibratory nutrients being transmitted as well. As we evolve, we will rely less and less on our physical vessel and live more presently in our light body. This happens over a very long duration of time, but we can be fueled off of our environment and metaphysical nutrition. Sound truly is sustaining. And remember that the universe is made up of vibration, and all vibration is sound, even when we cannot hear it. So at the stage we are at now as human beings, food, sustenance, and water are fundamental for most. I think it's a lovely part of our experience right now. But there are those that claim to have given up food and water and live purely off of prana or life air. So they allegedly live on light. They call themselves breatharians. And many have gradually adapted that lifestyle. I have heard of cases in which it posed serious health risks for some, or even death occurred. But this is not necessarily true for the masses. So I do believe this can be achieved, although I think we should revel in the advantages of healthy eating and the benefits there, since we are still deeply connected to our physical form for the time being. That physical imagery is important when working to balance the spirit. So here's a little bit of music theory for you. A resonant frequency is the oscillation of a system at its natural or unforced resonance. So a resonant field occurs when two objects that have the same resonant frequency meet and create a combined resonant field. So the amplitude of an object's oscillations is increased by the matching vibrations of another object. So for instance, striking an A on a guitar string would cause a nearby guitar string tuned to an A to also ring out. Resonance can also occur when compatible frequencies or octavizations are present. So harmonic resonance spans a vast range of spatial scales, from the tiniest quantum material to particles of matter, to orbital resonances that emerge from the stars. And transformative resonance is when a stronger vibration can transform the resonant frequency of an object so that its resonant frequency is entrained to that of the stronger vibration. So we're looking at a law of attraction kind of concept with these principles. We can expand our view of resonant fields and look at resonating the energy of ideas and emotions or states of being, perceptions, etc. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single frequency. You can fuel resonance with intention. So forces of goodness can be strengthened in the body and in one's reality, but so can negative forces, because as we generate it within, we pull ourselves into a reflective reality. So we will draw towards and match up with those potential realities that we are manifesting on a core level. Rooms or cavities of sorts also have a spatial resonance. So the effect depends on size and reverb of the wavelengths, how sound is absorbed and reflected. So sound travels as fluctuations of compressed and spaced out air. And when we try to find spatial resonance, the wavelength is going to equal the speed of sound divided by the distance between two parallel walls. So one can take two opposing surfaces in the room, double the distance because it is a round trip for the sound, and divide it into 1,130 feet, which is the speed of sound per second, in order to find that spatial resonance in hertz. So if you did this with all three parallel walls in a space, you could find a resonant chord for the room. So this is a picture of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And when people tone the spatial resonance chord of the room, it allows for access to portal connections to higher states of consciousness and outer dimensional spaces. And this occurs because of the wall reliefs present in the chamber. So most of the temples in Egypt have images carved into the walls, often thousands of them. And these reliefs make the distance between the walls have variation, thus allowing that information to break up the sound waves bouncing back and forth. So it transmutes the carvings on the walls into receptors in one's form. John Reed and his team stretched a thin cloth over the sarcophagus in the King's Chamber and used a tone generator and the resonant frequencies of the room to vibrate powder on the cloth. So he was essentially using cymatics as a part of this experiment. And in his book, Egyptian Sonics, he explains how the hieroglyphics formed in the powder on top of the cloth when that resonant chord of the room was hit. So basically, the chamber and sarcophagus acoustically coupled. There are many structures around the world that over time have been built with very specific measurements, materials, with certain form, and for a particular purpose. Most of those purposes being spiritual in nature. But there are also many structures that are still undiscovered, hidden, or no longer exist. One of my teachers from the sound therapy school that I attended has actually been to this pyramid, and he mentioned that he and a few others in his group toned the resonant chord of the room for several hours, and then finally opened up to the Akashic records, which is kind of like the Earth's subconscious memory bank. So, just as all vibratory particles elicit sound and contain light and shape, so too do they embody a hue or tone. So, color therapy is based on the idea that colors are these electrical impulses that stimulate processes in the body, nourish and rejuvenate our field, and promote psychological balance. They affect our mood, and each color is known to bring about different effects. But although most people agree on distinct properties, it is helpful to find what color or colors best suit the individual in that time. So, color manifests in two ways: in pigment and in light. So, pigment is the light that we see reflected off of things. We see an object when light from that object enters the eyes and strikes photoreceptors. So, color is visible because it bends, reflects, and refracts through particles and objects. And when different proportions of that red, green, and blue light enter the eye, the brain is also able to interpret the different combinations as different colors. So, pigments are chemicals that absorb selective wavelengths. They are actually preventing certain wavelengths of light from being transmitted or reflected. So, every element has a unique set of spectral lines or narrow ranges of frequency that it will emit. And this collection of lines determines the color that we see within that element. Light is colored electromagnetic radiation that travels at 186,000 miles per second. Clear white light is all colors, while a black surface is a surface that reflects all colors. So a black surface is really the absence of color. A wavelength equals the speed of light in nanometers per second divided by the frequency of the color, which is also in nanometers. And you can see that light, color, and sound become interchangeable. Each is a part of the other. So, sacred geometry is a complex system of symbols and structures involving space, time, and form. And this allows us to apply meaning to geometric shapes and proportions. The synchronicity of the universe is determined by mathematical constants that express themselves in the form of these patterns and cycles in nature. Geos means earth, and metron means measurements. So these are earth measurements, and they are made up of points, lines, curvatures, circles, spirals, etc. We are spirits having a physical experience in the womb of a quantum universe. So, in understanding material reality, it is important to observe those reoccurring patterns. Designs in nature follow geometrical archetypes, which are going to further reveal those vibrational resonances. It is also symbolic of the inseparable relationship of the part to the whole. We're looking at that principle of oneness. So the sphere is the ultimate expression of unity and completeness, because there's no point of greater or lesser importance. All points on the surface are equally accessible and regarded by the center of origin. And that center is an infinite microscopic point. It needs no dimension, and it embraces all dimension. So we have the eye of God, or the Vesica Pisces. It's sometimes called the bladder of a fish. It is two interlocking circles with the same radius intersecting one another. And it is said to be the root of all sacred geometry. All form is said to spring from this shape. And I think it's safe to say that the circle would probably be the most basic form, or the torus figure, but we will be discussing that in a bit. Two interlocking circles or spheres would be the first expression from that initial circle or sphere. So these ratios, harmonics, and proportions are found in music, light, and cosmology, and we can look towards the relationship and connection of these forms in gaining insight into universal law. So I like the following quotes. One says that numbers are like the thoughts of God. The construction of the physical world is based on eternal numbers, and mathematics is like the alphabet with which God has written the universe. So we are continuing with more foundational points of molecular structure. We have the seed of life, which is an extension of the Vesica Pisces, and the egg of life is simply the seed of life but made with three-dimensional spheres. So there are 7 interlocking circles, which then proliferates into the flower of life, which is said to be the pattern of creation. It's more elaborate than the seed of life. The tree of life is made when straight lines are drawn from the intersecting points of the 7 interlocking circles of the seed of life. Metatron's cube is composed of 13 spheres held together by lines drawn from the midpoint of each sphere. So it depicts the 5 platonic solids, which are derived from the flower of life. So there are an infinite number of forms that can be created using shape. Remember that consistency and clarity create recognizable form. So a person will project themselves in more defined energetic patterns when he or she resides in centered spaces. I like the quote that says, "People say that the soul, on hearing the song of creation, entered the body, but in reality the soul itself was the song." So these first 5 shapes are our platonic solids. They are 3-dimensional figures. They are the only 5 solids made from the same equilateral and equiangular polygons. So all of the shapes used to make up the platonic solids are contained within Metatron's cube, which we talked about earlier. The platonic solids are all convex. All of the faces, edges, and angles are identical, and the points all fit exactly inside of a sphere. So we have the tetrahedron, which is made up of 4 equilateral triangles, the hexahedron, which is 4 equilateral squares, the octahedron, which is 8 equilateral triangles, the icosahedron, which is 20 equilateral triangles, and the dodecahedron, which is 12 equilateral pentagons. And some of these figures and renditions of such are used as an envisioned surrounding structure, sometimes for meditation, and many times as a form of protection. We have Merkabas. Mer means light, Ka means spirit, and Ba means body. These are 2 intersecting tetrahedrons, so it forms a star-like figure. They consist of counter-rotating fields of light and energy that surround a person. So it's referred to as a divine vehicle for ascension. It can be used to connect with higher realms, and this relates back to Metatron's cube again. And they can be activated through practice, conscious unification of personal power and interconnection. So here we have a couple of images depicting a torus attractor. And a torus is a fundamental form of balanced energy flow found in sustainable systems at all scales. So it's created by rotating a circle around a line tangent, and it's an echoing of the spherical paradigm of macrocosm versus microcosm and simultaneous potential and expression. So it's a primal form of all vortices and energy systems. And it's the primary component that enables that seamless fractal embedding of energy flow. So it's a dynamic exchange of information that occurs throughout every level of the cosmic experience. And at its very center, the entire system comes to a point of stillness. So it's a state of ultimate equilibrium. I like the quote that says, "There is geometry in the humming of the strings, and there is music in the spacing of the spheres." This was said by Pythagoras many years ago. So we know that vibration creates sound, and sound creates form. So for example, a line can be compared to a frequency, the frequency of the line being based on the length of the line. And there's a vibrational interval in the relationship of any two lines. So in the same way, every structure in the universe can be mapped out in the form of sound, no matter the complexity. Now, this example may not be exact in a physics sense, but the idea is present in this explanation. Every vibration has a corresponding shape and vice versa, because music is a system of relationships, these being the harmonic intervals between notes and the combination of these intervals in creating melodies. So the rhythm, the pitch, and the tempo of pulsation or music can influence those mathematical measurements of time and frequency. So units like hertz and degrees are not technically the same, but the formulas and ratios are similar, if not identical in some ways. For instance, a 3:2 ratio, which is a musical fifth, means that the frequency of one note is 1.5 times the frequency of the other note. So I think it's important to note that with equal temperament, perfect geometrical shapes are created, but this is not the case with the other scales. Remember that the Pythagorean and just intonation scales are a bit more appealing to the ear and seem to be more in line with natural patterns. So I think it's pivotal to recognize that we are not necessarily meant to reside in perfect space. We can look towards being present with higher clarity and balanced consistency, but we must also allow for appropriate ebb and flow, so that yielding to imperfection. So a tone circle is a geometrical representation of relationships among the 12 pitch interval system. So the most common tone circles in Western music are the chromatic circle and the circle of four surface, depending on the clockwise or counterclockwise rotation. But basically, we are looking at 13 musical intervals within an octave. And the connection of each tone to another within the wheel will result in an interval. Logistically, some of these semitones are half steps and could potentially be represented by a smaller segment of the wheel. But keep in mind too, this explanation is not going to be precisely in line with quantum physics, similar to the last slide. This is a fairly under-researched subject, but as technology advances, so does our ability to understand the translation of sound and shape and how it's computed. But for the sake of having a visual, I wanted to touch on this. In the top left corner, we have lines created based on the intervals of certain notes. So the simplest shape, perhaps besides a point, of course, is a line. And the connected tones in the chromatic circle and the circle of fifths are each a tritone apart from one another. So a tritone is an interval of 3 whole tones. In the bottom left corner, we have trigons that are created, and the clockwise connected tones are a major third apart from one another. In the top right corner, we have squares, and the clockwise connected tones are a minor third apart from one another, and the counterclockwise connected tones are a major sixth apart. We have a hexagon that is created in the bottom right corner. So the clockwise connected tones are a major second apart from one another, and the counterclockwise connected tones are a minor seventh apart. And this continues with the dodecagon, which is not pictured here. And here is a superimposed image of all of the geometric shapes made with tone intervals combined. And this is a circle of fifths wheel that we are looking at here. So to preface, there is a lot of music theory that I'm going to omit here for the sake of time. But I want to give one more example. This is a circle of fifths wheel showing 3 augmented triads. So one trigon is formed from 3 augmented triads. And when you combine the 2 created trigons, you get a hexatonic 6-tone scale, right? And if we refer back to the Merkaba shape momentarily, we will find a emergence of 2 3D tetrahedrons. So to create a tetrahedron, you need 4 2D trigons. Now, the body is a very complex organism. The universe is an extremely complex organism. It is manifold. And if we consider the intricacy of the heart or the brain, for instance, we can imagine that the structures formed from such will be very elaborate because, too, there's so much more tied to the heart than simply muscle tissue. We are dealing with thoughts and feelings and encodings and memories and levels of love and connection, and to that end, pain as well. All of which are going to have very distinct and highly involved vibratory patterns and sequences. So you can imagine what our life force in motion looks like in terms of geometric figures. It is incredibly unique. So the sound healing school that I attended online is based out of California. And they've been working a lot with virtual reality healing systems. So they utilize a 3D graphic of the inside of the body, and sounds are correlated with shape and color and appropriately dispensed through the table. So with this program, a person can choose and place a healing visual inside a particular part of the virtual body, and a corresponding sound would then reverberate through the table in that location. So at this Sound Institute, they are developing databases of sounds and visuals for each part of the body, and also for specific health issues. So you could have a whole mix or symphony of sorts spread throughout the body visually and orally. They also have a project at this institute called the Genome Project, and the goal is to map frequencies and rhythms within the tissues of the body. And since many of these will differ from person to person, they are looking for musical intervals or relationships between various parts of the body. Their assumption is that patterns will begin to emerge within those musical intervals noted. But it's important that the tissues are in a state of good health and functioning efficiently. So you can see why this requires a lot of time and research. Most people do not have optimally functioning organs. And additionally, there may end up being more unique characteristics per individual than can adequately be calculated. They have also developed a virtual mixer, which is a soundboard that can be controlled by the client. So the client has access to 3D visuals of each sound in a mix, which can be grabbed with a data glove and moved around so that it is relayed through the speakers accordingly. You can control many functions with this program, including volume, left-right placement, equalization, and other modulation effects. So I want to speak briefly on the realm of stones, herbs, oils, etc. Crystals, plant matter, and these other concentrations emit specific frequencies based on their material, size, and inner components. So the overall structure is made of these layering musical intervals, which ultimately create an overall timbre. So each naturally occurring organism or structure holds a spiritual essence of sorts. They are especially distinctive in their qualities, and this can be observed in their vibratory makeup. So frequency can be mapped to sound using certain mathematical calculations, but it can be intuitively attuned to as well. And to that end, anything in your reality can be instinctively tapped into. The frequencies of these embodiments are in the millions of hertz. So these natural formations and entities are going to be pulsating well outside of our hearing range, but they can be octavized down. The energy of a pitch is the same in all octaves. So an octavized A will hold similar resonance to the other A's at higher and lower pitches. So as we consider all of the varying vibrational properties that these natural structures carry, we can explicitly pair them with our own being and utilize their components with purpose. So people can implement those herbs or stones or oils with traits that are especially helpful in dealing with a targeted issue. So we're looking for harmonious connection between those structures and particular cells or tissues or manifestations of the psyche. So we have about 6 different categories of brainwave states. The first being subdelta, which is less than 0.5 cycles per second. And this is associated with the basic cerebral rhythms that underlie those higher brain functions. So it is especially slow. We have the delta state, which ranges from 0.5 to 4 cycles per second. And this is affiliated with deep sleep and deep meditation. And healing and regeneration are also stimulated in this state, which makes sense because we know that deep restorative sleep is essential in the healing process. And I heard that the brain vibrates at a frequency of zero point 0.1 cycles per second when the heart is in a state of coherence or transmitting love, which also matches the rhythm of a slow breath. And supposedly, ocean waves are able to entrain you into a state of delta as well. We then have the theta brain waves, which range from 4 to 7 cycles per second. This is our dream state, our creative space, our portal to oneness. It's also our gateway to learning and memory and intuition. The senses are withdrawn from the external world and focused on signals originating from within. So this is more of a lucid state. There tends to be a lot of vivid imagery here. And here we can better connect to information lying in the subconscious realm as well. Fun fact, the brain's sodium-potassium levels are reset during theta, which supports transportation of chemicals in and out of brain cells and helps in eliminating mental fatigue. We then have the alpha state, which ranges from 7 to 12 cycles per second. And here we are dealing with relaxed attention, problem solving, presence. This state is more dominant when we are experiencing quietly flowing thoughts. So when we are able to occupy the power of the now moment, it aids in mental coordination, alertness, and mind-body integration. We then have the beta brain waves, which range from 12 to 30 cycles per second. And this is our normal day-to-day thinking and processing. This state is activated when we perform cognitive tasks or when we need to be engaged in decision-making or concentrated efforts of some kind. High beta can be related to anxiety or excitement. It takes a lot of energy to run at this speed. Uneasiness and apprehension can be a very exhausting process to undergo, and I think much of society occupies this state of stress far too regularly. It's most certainly a health hazard. And lastly, we have the gamma state, which ranges from 30 to 100 cycles per second. And it is usually associated with higher states of meditation. So it is an exceptionally fast rhythm and relates to simultaneous processing of information in different areas of the brain. So it's also highly active when in a state of universal love or when absorbed in higher virtues. And it's speculated that these rhythms modulate perception and consciousness. So a greater presence of gamma can give way to spiritual emergence. Another fun fact, the purring frequency of a cat is typically in gamma, and the breath of a purr is often in delta. So when an individual accesses high states of consciousness or deep states of meditation, brain waves are both really high and really low. They occupy sub-delta and gamma simultaneously. We don't know everything about what each of these brainwave states do, but they can be prompted in a person via instrumentation or conscious motivation. Although multiple brainwaves can occur at once, there is usually one that is the most dominant. So binaural beats are frequencies below the normal hearing range that entrain the brain into various brainwave states. So that of delta, theta, alpha, beta, or gamma. And they may assist with conditions like ADD or ADHD, post-traumatic stress, learning disabilities, sleep disorders, mental clarity, memory, creativity, left-right brain synchronization, deep meditation, etc. There is something called the Roshi system. It's a neurofeedback device that trains people to regulate their own brainwaves. So the system changes tempo from one brainwave state to another based on the Fibonacci curve. So it speeds up and slows down accordingly and helps break up stuck brainwaves, such as those that occur with PTSD. So the person sees a color display showing moment-to-moment changes in his or her brainwaves. There's also a tone that comes on when the individual is occupying the intended brainwave state. So it trains you to regulate the brainwaves that underlie your different emotions and moods or mental states. And irregular brainwaves that are in a state of chronic underarousal or hyperarousal are correlated with many physical symptoms and states of depression or anxiety, as well as learning disorders. And that irregularity can be generated from many different sources. We can also entrain the brain using tuning forks or headphones. So, for instance, one ear would receive 100 hertz and the other ear 104 hertz. The two frequencies cancel each other out with a remainder of 4 cycles per second. So the rhythm created equals out into a theta brainwave state. There are other light systems similar to this one that will flash at, say, 10 flashes per second and trigger the brain into a state of alpha, for example, if that was the case. The brain's frequency following mechanism is called entrainment. So you can see here that there are many different ideas about connecting into each chakra center. And I would say as long as you hold awareness and intention within yourself, you will be successful in your efforts. But there are practices that have been historically turned to as a means of promoting those objectives. The first section here is assorted manners of toning, basically. You can see that the sounds are centralized around vowel resonations. So slight variations are present, of course. The ordering also differs, and you'll see ordering differences also in the pitch and color categories. Some include consonants, but still emphasize the vowel sounds. And the Tibetan warrior model actually only recognizes 5 main centers. With the second section, I personally like David Gibson's take on timbres and frequencies. They make the most sense to me. But I do want to point out that he has sectioned out the centers within our hearing range, which is still useful and relevant. But the chakras are all technically humming way outside of that spectrum. But you can understand the expected tiered layers and how it would potentially be organized. It follows natural ordering, like we talked about with musical scales and planetary configurations and physical structures and sacred geometry patterns. It's something we can employ in a more tangible sense as we use sound in this perceived dimensional space. But just because we can't hear it doesn't mean we can't attune to it. I think any of these models can be utilized as a reference tool, but it's best to find what intuitively suits you. So there is a program that I've used before called the Sensorium. It is a microprocessor controlled synthesizer that generates sequences of pulsating light, sound, and vibratory outputs or tactile sensations. And it encourages the concept of sensory resonance. So this is a state of mind in which all of the main sensory mechanisms are synchronized into one coherent state. And it relieves the conscious mind from the responsibility of interpreting information and allows consciousness to rise to a higher state of awareness by turning inward. So the resultant coherence harmonizes the mind into a whole brain state of experience, which frees the brain from the need to analyze sensory input. When this state of mind is induced, we may experience synesthesia, which I've mentioned before, and this may occur when sensory lines begin to blur and we tap into more subtle waves of interpretation, or that which is not received so literally by our human form. So, for example, seeing sound, hearing light, or feeling music,